This exhibit was conceived as a kind of a love letter to the Mediterranean Sea, and thinking about the Mediterranean as a complex interstice of human language, thought, culture, memory, philosophy, technology. I'm Myron Groover, Archives and Rare Books Librarian at McMaster University, and I'm the lead curator of The Great Sea, Human Imaginaries of the Mediterranean from Antiquity to Modernity. And thinking about what this region means now and in historical context as a kind of connective tissue for a lot of the common ideas that so many people in the world have about democracy, what it means to live a good life, how we think about the future, how we think about our relationship to the past, how we think about language, philosophy, food, art. The Mediterranean has played an outsized role, not just in shaping these ideas, but as a conduit by which they've traveled. One of the things that we were thinking about when we put this exhibit together was the Mediterranean as a locus of historical conversation. So thinking not just about the present day inhabitants of the Mediterranean shores, but thinking about the long history of this region and its pivotal role in some of the great evolutions of human history. If you pick at any of these threads of history, culture, language, memory, you find that they're connected to a much broader tapestry of time and cultural interchange. So through this exhibit, we're looking not only at the ideas and peoples which coalesced in the Mediterranean region, we're also thinking about how they influenced a much larger geographical region, including Canada and including, in some sense, the wider world. One of my favorite objects in the exhibit, which speaks to this kind of complex and broad percolation of ideas and languages over time, was actually produced in Sweden. And you might wonder, well, what does a book published in Sweden have to tell me about the Mediterranean Sea and its impact on the world? Well, this book was essentially a PhD dissertation. It was published in the 1730s in Uppsala, which is only a few hundred kilometers from the Arctic Circle. And it was produced by a scholar whose specialty was classical Arabic. And as a PhD thesis, then as now, this scholar was able to make his name by translating a work that had never been translated out of Arabic before into Latin. So he undertook the first Latin translation of a Syrian cosmological treatise by a gentleman named Ibn al-Wardi. And what we see here is a really interesting moment, because Arabic and Latin are two of the great Mediterranean languages. Both of them become, through their political and religious connections, vehicles for much larger cultural forces than the language contexts in which these dialects first coalesced. And so Latin and Arabic are both languages of global scholarly interchange. And so you have somebody moving a text from one Mediterranean linguistic context into another for the benefit of a new audience. And this work is taking place hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from the shores of the Mediterranean. Another text in the exhibit was published in 1493 in Germany, and it has a beautiful woodcut illustration of the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman forces of Mehmet II. This points to the intense emotional connection that people far from the Mediterranean shores had to places and events that were taking place in and around the Mediterranean. Here at McMaster, we possess one of Canada's finest rare book collections, some 100,000 rare and significant volumes, dating really back to sort of the high European Middle Ages, all the way through to the present day. So this is a collection that is capable of speaking to an intense breadth of human experience, a collection that reflects dozens of languages, dozens of ways of being, dozens of script systems. We also have a map department in the library, which has an amazing, globally significant collection of historical maps. And we have this phenomenal Museum of Art on campus, which has a very strong collection of antiquities and objects. And this exhibit gave me, as a curator, the chance to pull together materials from all three of these collections. And one of my favorite cases in the exhibit is a case of objects from what are today sort of Syria, Palestine, Israel, the Levant. And in that case are a number of small bottles all of which look quite similar to one another. And these bottles were intended to hold perfumed oils that were used to improve people's personal fragrance and used in bathing and things of that nature. But the interesting thing about this small collection of bottles, although they look very similar, they were produced over a 1,000-year time period. And what we're seeing there is a through line of material culture that transcends language, it transcends the changing political boundaries, and it shows that there's a commonality of experience and a commonality of culture in this part of the Mediterranean that is beyond the individual life worlds of the peoples and the dynasties that sort of cycle through and are always replacing one another. And so through this kind of object case, we're seeing a broader story that we discuss a lot in this exhibit, and that's the idea of cycles of deep time and cycles of deep continuity. The world we live in today is in conversation of the Mediterranean world 500 years ago. It's in conversation with the Mediterranean world 2,000 years ago. And what this exhibit gives us an opportunity to do is to explore some of those histories and those stories. One of the things that was important as I was curating this exhibit was to try and showcase a real breadth of intellectual output. Rare book collections in Western institutions can tend to be very European. They can be very focused on what I might think of as the Latin cultural sphere and its heirs. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in this exhibit was to emphasize the crucial role of Arabic and Hebrew as languages of philosophy, scholarship, and global interchange. So the exhibit itself is a love letter to the Mediterranean, but it's also a love letter between Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and the societies and cultures that have been shaped by those linguistic traditions. So we're looking at language as it evolves over time. We're looking at the stability of language. And one of my favorite objects in the exhibit is a very, very famous book. It's a volume from what's called the Plantin Polyglot. The Plantin Polyglot was an amazingly complex publishing process and project that was undertaken in the 1560s. And you might have guessed from the name polyglot, the interesting thing about this text, nominally it's just the Bible, but it was doing something really radical and subversive for the 1560s at any rate, was to publish a Bible that pulled all of the original source texts together in one place for comparison. Something that was, at best, contrary to church teaching, at worst was actively heretical. But here we have a Bible that is published, and on one page we can see together Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Syriac, Chaldean, etc. Whatever the earliest texts they could find, they were publishing in this book. The book also ran into a lot of hot water because the scholars who were involved with the project worked very closely with the rabbinical community. They were working closely with rabbis, they were reading Mishnaic sources, they were talking to the rabbinical community about their commentaries and their history of engagement with the biblical texts. And to say that this was controversial in mid-16th century Europe would be to understate things. The chronology of this exhibit takes us from the early centuries before the Common Era. So I think the oldest thing in the exhibit is from about 800 BCE. So we're looking at a chronology that stretches from about that time period through to about the year 1800. And so we're looking at a very, very long time period, but we sort of leave the Mediterranean deliberately on the very cusp of modernity. And the exhibit is imagined as a physical journey around the shores of the Mediterranean. So the gallery space is actually arranged in a clockwise fashion. And the conceptual heart of the exhibit and its centerpiece is one of the very few surviving copies of a very famous book called the Jadid Atlas Terkümesi, which means in Turkish something like the New Atlas translated into Turkish. This was a book that was produced around the year 1803, 1804 in Constantinople as an atlas which sought to make use of the best innovations in European cartographic technology, the best innovations in European graphical technology for representing maps, but it's made in Constantinople under the auspices of Selim III, who was the emperor, the Ottoman emperor at that time. And this is a book so rare that as few as 10 copies are known to survive worldwide. This is the only copy in Canada, one of maybe only 3 or 4 in all of the Americas. Only 50 of these were ever produced. And it's a beguiling artifact in that it's filled with very European-looking maps that were produced using copperplate engravings, technology that was not very widely used in Constantinople at that time. So you see an object that brings together a very European gaze, a very European articulation of cartography, and yet all of these plates were re-engraved from their original sources with beautiful captions in the Nastaliq script. Ottoman Turkish was written in a Perso-Arabic script. It no longer is today, but this book has beautiful calligraphic captions in that script. And so you see a work that is simultaneously Western and Eastern, that is simultaneously Turkish and global, that is simultaneously Ottoman, French, English. It's bringing all of these contradictions and complexities together. And this book was generated as part of a reform effort. The Sultan was interested in making sure that the Ottoman Empire had a future, looking presciently forward to the rising tides of nationalism, nationalistic discourse that would kind of tear the Mediterranean apart in the 19th century. And so we leave the exhibit really around that time, where you have this book being produced in Istanbul at the crossroads of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, crossroads of North and South, crossroads of East and West, a crux of continents, a crux of different waterways, a crux of Christianity and Islam. This book is produced in this sort of navel of the world during a moment when the Ottomans are looking forward to an uncertain future. So we leave our story at a moment when everything is up in the air for the peoples who live around the Mediterranean. If we were to look at the map of the Mediterranean 100 years after the exhibit leaves us, we would find an almost unrecognizable world. And yet, these through lines of culture, language, commerce, technology are still with us, providing us a connection to that older world. Through this exhibit, we have the chance to examine almost 2,000 years of human chronology and thought. We have the chance to engage with 7 or 8 different languages, 6 or 7 different script systems. And through examining these objects and the stories we tell, we find that they are our stories. And one of my favorite things about this exhibit has been the chance to interact with visitors to this space and to hear about the stories of personal connection where somebody sees something on a map or reads something on a page that's capable of speaking to a very personal experiences of theirs. And it's those moments of self-recognition that you get to see in an audience that are so meaningful as a curator. And I've really been blessed to see with this exhibit in particular many, many such moments. And I hope this conversation and this curatorial theme will continue as we look back on the exhibit.